Well, I think the good thing about qualifying at Monza, bearing in mind that 9 drivers went into Q1 knowing that regardless of what they did, they were going to get some sort of penalty, some of them at the back of the grid. In the case of Max Verstappen, the most lenient of penalties, only a 5-placer. I think the good thing about it was that ultimately it was Charles Leclerc, who doesn't have any penalties, who took the pole, because if Carlos Sainz had got the pole, or even Max, you would have thought, yeah, another one of these things where all that effort, all that work, all that perfection amounts to not as much as it should. Having said all of that, as I say, at Monza it was Charles Leclerc who got the pole, did another of his beautiful laps right at the end of Q3. I've been banging on all year about how good he is in those last few seconds of Q3 when the pressure's really on. And the pressure was really on. You could say, yeah, the pole was his for the taking with Max and Carlos Sainz and Sergio Perez all having grid penalties, but ultimately he is a Ferrari driver. It is the 75th anniversary of their first Grand Prix in Formula One. And Charles Leclerc was out there in front of his fans, in front of the Tifosi, and they wanted nothing less than the pole, and that's what he got. It was close in the end. Max did a 20.3 to Charles' 20.1, and I think that lap time reflects how Red Bull have gone into this weekend. As I said in the build-up to this, Red Bull were always going to run the top speed that made them commensurate with everybody else around them, and they were going to absorb that advantage through tyre management in the race. And we'll get onto that in a minute, how good Max Verstappen is still looking with a full load of fuel in the car. But going into Q3, of course, I think Max would love to have been quickest, but I don't think he's worried at all that he's only P2, because had they been going for a genuine pole, I'm sure they would have run slightly less wing. Let's have a look at how they compared. In terms of top speed, only 1 kilometre of an hour between them. Max 342 through the trap, Charles Leclerc 341. Now, that isn't what we saw at Spa. It isn't even what we saw at Zandvoort. So on that basis, you've got to say that Red Bull are running quite a lot of downforce, and that's because they're going into a tyre management Grand Prix. Have a look at the sector times too. That's 26.7 for sector 1, Charles Leclerc, 26.9 for Max Verstappen. That's heavy braking from high speed. That's leaving lots of margin. You can be sure about that. Sector 2, with his tyres nicely coming in, Max and Charles both quickest, 26.8. That's the one with the Lesmos in. Charles really good through the Lesmos, picked up a lot of pace compared with FP3, where he was complaining this morning about the turn-in into the first Lesmo. Looked pretty good, but from where he was sitting, I guess he felt that he had quite a lot of understeer. So they worked quite a lot on that, presumably put on a bit more front flap on the car. And in the final sector, very similar, 26.5, again 310 to 311. One thing I would say is that Charles Leclerc, like George Russell, I would highlight those two of the best drivers out of Ascari. The detail of their exits out of Ascari, just superb, absolutely on the right, on the white line, on the right-hand side of the track, as long as they can do it before they move across to the left. And it's astonishing to me that more drivers aren't watching what others are doing. I mean, if drivers like Leclerc and George Russell, who are really quick, are doing that, wouldn't you, if you were, I don't know, Nyck De Vries, having your first Grand Prix in a Williams, having done FP1 for Aston Martin yesterday, wouldn't you be looking at what they're doing out of Ascari and thinking, why are they doing that? Obviously, it's for a reason. We explained that reason yesterday. Lewis Hamilton kind of does it, but he's a bit lazy in when he comes across. Same with Max. Sergio Perez doesn't do it at all. Carlos Sainz doesn't do it at all. But then you got George and Charles Leclerc, absolutely beautiful out of Ascari. And as I say, just to repeat the point, I find it astonishing. Lando Norris too, not brilliant out of there either. You'd think he'd be looking at it, thinking, oh, what's George doing out of there? Well, that's weird. Why is he doing that? You'd think there'd be some of that going on, but there isn't. You know, there's so much micromanagement by the engineers, and yet when it comes down to something fairly basic like that and very visible, nobody seems to take any notice at all. I have no idea why that would be the case. Don't ask me, because all I can assume is that everybody is so focused on their own little world, they've actually now got to the point where they never look at what anybody else is doing at all. Can you imagine, I know I'm being sidetracked here, but you can imagine, I don't know, Australian Open 3 years ago, Roger Federer walking past a practice court where Rafa Nadal is warming up. You think Federer would just walk past? You don't think he would stop and have a little bit of a look at what Nadal's doing with his forehand or his volley or his serve or whatever? Why wouldn't you do that? It's just extraordinary to me. And we got some really good overhead shots of how detailed George and Charles were out of Ascari. And nobody was making any comment about it whatsoever, going on about lots of other stuff, comparing this, comparing that. All minute detail isn't that important. And here's something that's really critical to the lap. It adds up. It's probably only a few hundredths of a second on a lap, but if you multiply that by the full race distance, that's quite an advantage, is it not? It also looks after the engine as well. Anyway, enough of that. Let's have a look now at how the grid will actually line up. Well, behind Charles Leclerc, you've got 4 drivers, Max Verstappen, Carlos Sainz, Sergio Perez and Lewis Hamilton, all of whom have penalties. So it's George Russell who will be lining up alongside Charles on the front of the grid for the Italian Grand Prix in the Mercedes. Wow. P3, Lando Norris in the McLaren. P4, backed up by Daniel Ricciardo, last year's winner in the other McLaren. So a great performance for McLaren. They would have had a feel for the second row as well going into qualifying and did a really good job in getting both cars up there. I say that only because it's been so difficult in recent times for Daniel. Of course, this isn't the most difficult of Grand Prix circuits, and if it's a pretty good Grand Prix car, and you are Daniel, and you are getting all this micromanagement of the lap from Lando, you are going to deliver, because it's one of the circuits where even if you are perhaps past your best, if that's the right way to phrase it, you are going to pick up that time and you are going to be there. So Daniel Ricciardo starting on the second row of the grid alongside Lando Norris. And then I thought one of the outstanding performances of the day, Pierre Gasly in the Tauri, which hasn't been a good car for the last, I don't know how long, certainly the last couple of months in Formula One. Yuki Tsunoda's looked reasonably good on occasion, but very erratic. And Pierre Gasly, another driver with no penalties, incredibly, coming into this weekend. A really good lap, I thought, 22.6. And the AlphaTauri really quick on the straight, right up there with Ferrari and Red Bull, when Red Bull are running a lot of wing. 341. McLaren's, however, 333, 337 around there, so significantly slower than the AlphaTauri. And that, of course, could be a factor in the race because they're going to be very bunched up in the midfield there for sure. Having said that, Pierre's performance P9 or P5 in reality needs to be seen in the context of Fernando Alonso, who will start P6, not doing any laps at all in Q3, presumably because they were limited in terms of soft tyres. But just to reiterate the point about Pierre Gasly, the new teammate of Esteban Ocon in Alpine next year, going slightly quicker than Esteban around Monza, so that will be, the needle match has begun, you could say. One of the other outstanding performances I thought of qualifying was Nyck De Vries, who yesterday sat in Sebastian Vettel's car at Aston Martin for the first session for FP1 and was in the garage area. And when Alex Albon took ill this morning with suspected appendicitis, and we wish him well, quick recovery. So it was Nyck who was drafted into the Williams, jumped in the car and straight away got out of Q1 with Nicholas Latifi locking up going into the first chicane, also trying to get out of Q1 and not quite making it. So a significantly good performance from Nyck De Vries, who of course has been a McLaren test driver for many years, right on the fringe of Formula One, but good to see a driver with talent like that being given an opportunity. He did make his own mistake going into the second chicane on his second run in Q2, but that's kind of expected. His mileage, of course, incredibly limited. But those that didn't make it out of Q1, apart from Latifi, the 2 Haas's and the 2 Aston Martins, you kind of expect that from Haas. They're not brilliantly quick in a straight line. Air efficiency isn't one of their great hallmarks. But Mick Schumacher, in addition to that, didn't run in FP1 yesterday. Antonio Giovinazzi drove his car. And then when he did get in, all sorts of things went wrong with the gearbox, etc. And didn't do much running today. Very erratic, difficult day for Mick Schumacher. Not very good for Kevin Magnussen either, but he's also got penalties starting at the back of the grid. But for Aston Martin, no real excuses, because here's a weekend when there are 9 drivers, as I say, all with penalties, neither of whom are Sebastian Vettel or Lance Stroll. And if ever there was an opportunity for one of the midfield teams, like McLaren, like Alpine, like AlphaTauri, to take advantage of that, it would have been this weekend. And here's Aston Martin not even getting out of Q1. So this team beginning to really struggle, looking like they just have no sense of direction. Extraordinary that Aston Martin can be struggling so much, given how good that team was when it was Force India, or even on the transition from Force India to Racing Point, but now going backwards rapidly. I mentioned earlier that we might have a look now at how Max Verstappen's race might pan out tomorrow. But the first thing is, because he wasn't quickest in qualifying and he's got a 5-place grid penalty, that means he's now starting P7. So you could argue, wow, it's even better than P6 because he's on the clean side of the road. So that's one thing. And then beyond that, let's have a look at what he was doing this morning in FP3, knowing that he was going to be around there on the grid. Again, he was the only driver to do a proper long run. Neither Ferrari did a proper long run. This is an echo of what we saw on Friday. So Max has done a massive amount of homework now. This time he was on the medium tyre and he was doing that run. It's a 5-lap run, but a 5-lap run is quite a long run at Monza given the length of the lap. And it was quite interesting and significant, I thought, that he was doing that at a time when everybody else had been out and done a setup run and were then in the garage faffing around with fuel, doing other things. And already Max was out there, Red Bull were out there doing this run on a clear track, no traffic really. I think that last lap, 34.6, was a traffic drama. But really getting good information. In terms of organisation, no team in the pit lane looked better, definitely more organised in terms of getting lots of data on fuel runs. So there we are on the medium tyre again, 25.5, 26.0, 25.8, 25.8. Yeah, very, very impressive. Similarly, in the background, we had the two Mercs also doing long runs. Lewis Hamilton was there or thereabouts the times that George was doing. And you can see that 25.3, 25.1, 24.9, 24.4. And you think, wow, what is going on there? This is going to be one of these. The car is really quick on full tanks, on a full run. But look at the difference in trap speeds before we get too much further. They're the average times. I'm not putting in there any of the really quick ones when they were in tows, but Max 308, 312 on average. George doing those times, 304, 309. So significantly slower in a straight line. Bearing in mind, as we know, that Red Bull are running a relatively large amount of downforce because of where Max is going on the grid, and they really want to give him tyre management tomorrow. They know they're never going to be slow in a straight line. So how much fuel were they running, Mercedes, compared with Max at this point of FP3? Well, we found out when both of them went to light fuel runs towards the end of FP3 on new soft tyres, just to put in a lap to get a feel for how the car would be for qualifying. Max did a 21.2, 341 kilometers an hour on the straight. George Russell, in the same situation, same setup, 22.3, 331. So you can see from the top speeds that they are light at that point. So Max picked up 4.3 seconds, George Russell 2.1 seconds. So what does that tell you? That tells you that obviously George wasn't running full in that run. Probably most of you had worked that out anyway, but there's confirmation of how good a job Max and Red Bull have done going into the race tomorrow. Not the first time they've had to take a hit in terms of a penalty. As I say, a lot of them having to start from the back of the grid. Carlos Sainz is a very good example. Lewis Hamilton is another. But Max has only got that 5-place grid penalty, and that is because of a new internal combustion engine. Actually, if you think about it, if you put this in the context of Formula One's history, you'd think that the internal combustion engine, which is the actual engine, is the most important part. And it would be, wow, if you're going to change that, that would be back of the grid. But indeed, it's not. It just shows how electrified a Formula One car is in 2022. It's just, well, it's only the internal combustion engine, not much there. Beautiful things, all machined out of solid, lovely, compact, wonderful pieces of kit. But nonetheless, a 5-place grid penalty for Max because he's running the 5th ICE, as they call it. So there we are. Assuming Max gets through the first lap unscathed, particularly the first and second chicanes, and got to feel sorry for Lewis and Carlos and Sergio starting near the back of the grid in that, with all the traffic involved. Assuming Max gets through there, it could be quite an interesting race between him and Charles. You would imagine by the time Max has got through the traffic, and he's probably going to have quite a big battle with George Russell, I would guess, even though he would, I think on race day, he's going to have a significant top speed advantage when he needs it, as we saw at Zandvoort. But by the time he's through the traffic, will he be in a position to race Charles Leclerc? It's a very fast, if you like, short race in terms of time, the Italian Grand Prix. And for Max to pull off a win here, I don't think is going to be quite as easy as it was at Spa. Having said that, Charles hasn't done as much homework, hasn't been able to do as much running on full tanks on the Ferrari as Max. Max is right on top of tyre management in terms of the soft and the medium, and the hard, which I guess is just an extension of where he is with the medium. Whereas they're going a little bit into the unknown at Ferrari. I think they focus quite a lot on getting Charles as quick as he was in qualifying, getting that speed out of the car. Very important for Ferrari with all that yellow on it, that 75th anniversary and the Tifosi, to be on the pole and to be quickest, to be genuinely quickest, as distinct from inheriting a pole. And that's what they did. But in the race, it could well be different, give or take half distance, 2/3 distance in terms of where the track's going and where they are on strategy. Of course, we will see tomorrow, and I'll do another video after the race tomorrow. We'll do a debrief, live stream debrief on Twitch on Monday, starting at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, because so much else going on, but there's a slot I can find for a couple of hours. And in the meantime, take care, enjoy. The ending for this one is the 1971 Italian Grand Prix, another of those slipstream specials, an amazing race. This was won by Peter Gethin in the Yardley BRM. His only Formula One victory, but what a victory it was. And that winning margin over Ronnie Peterson in the March, still the smallest margin in the history of Formula One, 0.01 of a second. And if you look closely, only for a couple of seconds, you'll see a gentleman with a young kid next to him on the pit wall with stopwatches. That is Dr. Frank Faulkner, who's a very, very close friend of Ken Tyrrell's for many years, also an autosport journalist and also a first-class doctor. He was an American, and he came to quite a lot of Grand Prix with Ken. There he is doing the timing. And there's a bucktooth kid next to him who is Danny Sullivan, much younger, and of course we know him today, but that's about 71. He was racing in Formula Ford in the UK around 1980, Team Teal. And then of course he went on to race Formula One, particularly for Tyrrell, and he won the Indy 500 after that. But there's Danny Sullivan in very young age next to his mentor. Frank Faulkner was his mentor. I think they knew one another. I think he knew Danny when he was very, very young. And there he is at the Italian Grand Prix at Monza, helping Frank Faulkner with the timing. Blink and you'll miss it. It's right in the middle. But anyway, enjoy. Take care, and God bless the Queen.